Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Caesar Crosses the Rubicon by Historia Civilis. So with this reaction and the next one, which is Caesar Marches on Rome, we are getting to a very important point to Caesar's story that we've been building to for a while. We've been following Caesar's military journey in Gaul along with his political journey in Rome. And those two things are colliding, his political and military careers, in one of the most important moments in both his career and the history of Rome itself. So with that stated, I'm very excited to watch this video. If you guys end up enjoying this reaction, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction. Alright, here we go.
The conquest of Gaul should have been the apex of Julius Caesar's career. The experience transformed him into Rome's richest citizen and its second most accomplished general. Politically, he was more popular than ever, and an entire generation of young politicians now considered him the leader of their faction.
I mean, this is true. He has reached, both militarily and politically, about as high as he could expect to go. I mean, he is one of the most important men in Rome in terms of, military action, one of the most important generals, and politics. He's one of the most influential politicians. So realistically, he shouldn't expect to go much further. But of course, Caesar, he's different. He's not like any other great man or any other influential or impressive general. He takes it one step ahead.
In 3 years, he would be eligible to run for consul for the second time, and was projected to win in a landslide. It seemed that Caesar would dominate Roman politics for the rest of his life.
Well, true.
Instead, a little over 2 years after his victory at Alesia, Caesar marched on Rome, and the Roman Senate declared him an enemy of the Republic.
Yep.
How could this happen? Let's answer that question. In the aftermath of Alesia, Caesar was beginning the decades-long process of transitioning Gaul from an unruly frontier to a Roman province, but there was only so much he could do as governor. For the sake of administration, Caesar had simply thrown his conquests into the province of Transalpine Gaul. Eventually, Gaul would need to be partitioned, but this would require new legislation from the Senate. Moreover, Caesar spent the last several years buying off Gallic aristocrats with promises of Roman citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, Caesar's basically been, he's been making stuff up as he goes. We've seen all of his conquests. He now dominates Gaul, but of course, this is all basically unofficial, and it has to be codified by the Roman Senate. And when they do that, who knows exactly what they're going to take from him? He cannot expect to maintain the same level of power that he does right now.
Failure to deliver on this would jeopardize his new conquests. However, this would also require separate legislation from the Senate. Then there was his army. To conquer Gaul, Caesar had mobilized 50,000 soldiers. Most of these men were now approaching retirement, which usually meant that they received a plot of land from the government. If Caesar could find a way to settle these people in Italy, his 50,000 veterans would become 50,000 voters. That was enough to swing elections, but that, like everything else, would require its own legislation from the Senate.
Yes, and as we saw in earlier videos, the Senate and Caesar were not at all friendly. They were usually at each other's throats. Caesar did manage to get a lot of legislation pushed through, mostly because he forced it through. So we can sort of reasonably expect that if Caesar wants any special favors from the Senate, he's not going to get them without applying an appropriate level of force.
To put it quite simply, the Senate had to uphold Caesar's conquests with new legislation.
Yeah.
Currently, that wasn't happening. In order to make it happen, Caesar would need to be elected consul for the second time. Back in Rome, the city was still recovering from a dark period in its history. A few years earlier, angry politicians had taken advantage of dysfunction in the Senate, and gangs of armed supporters had taken control of the streets. For a while, it seemed that the Republic may be taken down by an angry mob. In a moment of desperation, the Senate turned to Rome's other most popular politician, Pompey, and empowered him to restore order. Pompey was a popular politician and a skilled general, but he wasn't one of those guys with strong ideological beliefs. That's a kind way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that Pompey was mostly looking out for himself and his own career. You know, a bit of an opportunist. Whatever beliefs would put him into a position of power, would win him support, that's probably what he would believe.
Some of his less kind contemporaries describe him as stupid. In his new role, Pompey...
I mean, you could say that, but Pompey is a very successful man, and he has managed to make his way to the top, with the help of others, but largely through his own influence, so you gotta give that to him. I'm not sure how stupid or intelligent he was, but there's clearly some thought going on up there.
Surrounded himself with conservatives, and we can say with some confidence that the more he did this, the more conservative he became. In the year 52 B.C.E., Rome received a double whammy of good news. Pompey restored order to the streets, and Caesar won an unprecedented victory against the Gauls at Alesia.
To be honest, I kind of thought, and you wouldn't be, maybe wrong for thinking that all that violence that was going on those Roman streets would lead directly to the end of the Republic, but, with Pompey empowered, he actually managed to clean up the violence a little bit. Now, of course, empowering one man has issues of its own, and this is exactly what Pompey wanted. He is pretty powerful, and he's going to get his way, but he did manage to get rid of a lot of that really disruptive political violence, which you wouldn't be blamed for thinking would have led to the end of the Republic. Maybe if you're sitting at this point, you've seen the streets get cleaned up, maybe politics is being cleaned up a little bit, maybe the Republic will make it. Maybe we're going to rebound. Of course, that is absolutely not what happened, but you wouldn't be forgiven for maybe having some hope at this point.
After so many years of uncertainty, Rome could now feel secure both at home and abroad. The city erupted into celebration. In the midst of this wave of public support, all 10 tribunes of the plebs backed a bill that would allow Caesar to stand for election in the year 49 without having to leave Gaul. The bill passed into law. Let's pause here. Why did Caesar and his allies want this? Rome had a strict rule that forbade governors and generals from entering the city.
Yeah, once again we touch on Roman legalism, which we've touched on several times throughout this series. When politicking in Rome, you have to be very knowledgeable and cautious with the rules. The Romans were very into their rules and, usually strict, although we've seen that at this point in the history of the Republic, rules were being broken left and right. But even still, there were a lot of sort of odd customs and rituals that had to be observed. And that's why, we have situations like this, and we've seen before in Caesar's career, where he has to sort of work around these things. Or, like I said, just straight up break the rules.
Even Pompey, who was technically the governor of the 2 Spanish provinces, was forced to take up residence just outside the city limits. But Rome had another rule, which said that all candidates for office had to stand for election in person, in the city. So what did governors who wanted to stand for election do? One rule saying that they could not enter the city, and another saying that they must. Usually, they just resigned 6 months early, and entered Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar didn't want to do that. Why?
Well, I reckon it's because that would be a little risky for him, but I guess we're about to see the reason why.
Because while in office, consuls and governors were immune from legal prosecution.
Yep, here it is. A lot of Roman legalism is the basis for Western law today. So we can see some remnants of this stuff in our own law, but this is exactly the case. While he was governor, Caesar had a level of immunity from prosecution to protect him, whether legitimate or illegitimate, from basically attacks from the conservative faction in Rome, because the second that he's a private citizen, all of his conservative opponents are going to try and destroy him with lawsuits and accusations. And Caesar obviously knows this, so he's doing everything he can to avoid that, which means he has to keep a position of public service, whether it be a governorship or a consulship.
We should remind ourselves why legal immunity was so important to Caesar. During his year as consul, Caesar illegally passed legislation after it was vetoed by his co-consul and several tribunes of the plebs. He oversaw and perhaps ordered the assault of a fellow consul. He incited a riot.
Yeah, and so this is why Caesar did not have a great relationship with the Senate. As I discussed earlier, I mean, they weren't cool from the beginning, but, Caesar basically just doing whatever he wanted while he was consul, that did not further endear him to the Senate, particularly the conservative faction of the Senate.
He arrested a senator for political reasons. I could go on.
Yeah.
As consul, Caesar showed no respect for the rule of law. Cato, one of the leaders of the conservative faction, went so far as to swear an oath to personally lead the prosecution of Caesar whenever his legal immunity expired.
Wow.
Prosecution would endanger all of Caesar's legislative accomplishments. Banishment was also a possibility. These guys weren't playing around. Were Cato and the conservative faction coming after Caesar for political reasons? Yes.
Obviously.
Was Caesar guilty of these crimes? Also yes.
Yeah, and this is where it gets, this is the interesting thing. And we see this in, politics today as well. In a situation like this, yes, Caesar is guilty of all these crimes. He has no respect for the rule of law. But he's not being targeted by the conservatives because of some legitimate belief in the rule of law. Let's be honest, they're targeting him for political reasons. They want to eliminate the leader of the reform faction. And we see this kind of stuff today where, you have countries, say, with authoritarian rulers and corruption is absolutely rampant. Russia's a good example of this. Every businessman, politician, public figure is corrupt in some way. Now, the government will target certain individuals and do corruption trials to try and destroy them. Now, are these people corrupt? Yes. Are they being targeted due to some genuine belief in the rule of law? No. They're being targeted because they're political opponents. And Rome is very much in a situation like this. I mean, Caesar is the most guilty, probably, of violating all these rules, but we've seen plenty of others who have done similar things, and plenty of others who are, very corrupt, either explicitly or behind the scenes. So, as Historia Civilis is saying, the accusations are fairly legitimate, but they're not being launched at Caesar due to genuine principle. They're being launched because of political opportunity.
Long story short, Caesar didn't want to risk battling it out in the courts. The conservative faction was well connected, and if it came down to it, he might lose. That's why, at the urging of Caesar's supporters, the tribunes of the plebs passed a law permitting Caesar to stand for election in absentia. This way, he could transition seamlessly from governor to consul, and then from consul to governor again, extending his legal immunity indefinitely. Cato and the conservatives were pretty upset by this law. They pushed back, and the Senate descended into a heated debate over the issue. Pompey, as Rome's leading citizen, decided to stay above the fray. Caesar should have been annoyed that the conservatives in the Senate were coming after him like this. As far as he was concerned, he was abiding by the letter of the law. Besides, earlier in Pompey's career, he had done the same thing, and nobody batted an eye.
Exactly, and that's the point I was just making. The attacks for whatever Caesar is doing are pretty much exclusively levied at him for political reasons. The conservative faction or whoever is attacking him doesn't really care about what he's doing. It's the fact that he's doing it.
It's also worth reminding ourselves that Pompey was serving as consul in the year 52, even though he was legally prohibited from doing so. This fact was definitely not lost on Caesar. If the Senate was going after him, why weren't they going after Pompey? Debate raged in the Senate. The conservative faction tried repealing the law allowing Caesar to stand for election, but the tribunes of the plebs vetoed every attempt at doing so. The two sides were at a stalemate.
51 BC.
Caesar had been elected consul in the year 59, and because of Roman law, he was not allowed to run for a second term until the election of the year 49. Immediately after his term as consul, Caesar became the governor of the Gallic provinces for a 5-year term, from 58 to 54. In the year 55, with the end of his term in sight, Caesar had the Senate extend his command for an additional 5 years. Now, with the Senate debating Caesar's future, members of the conservative faction went back and examined this law. They discovered that it was quite badly written and never actually specified when Caesar's second 5-year term would begin or end. The conservative faction took this information and ran with it. They argued that since the law didn't give any specific dates, Caesar's second term actually began the moment the legislation passed. This would mean that his term as governor would expire in March of the year 50, almost 2 years earlier than expected. I've said it several times, but it's key to this whole thing, so I'll say it again. Whenever Caesar's command expired, so did his legal immunity. This may seem like a tiny disagreement, but it would have massive ramifications.
Oh yeah, and like I said, we can see a lot of this Roman culture still around today. This sort of legalism, looking at the letter of the law extremely closely, parsing every single word and interpreting or misinterpreting the law differently. We absolutely have that today, and this is, we have a lot of court battles over laws and policies. How can this word be interpreted? A lot of that goes back to the Romans, and we can see that legalistic spirit here. Of course, it's sort of interesting. We're in, watching this video, a period of Roman history where that legalism is obviously still around, but so is just the frequent rule breaking. So it's very interesting. There's still this culture of following the law and looking at the law very closely. Yet, if you're powerful enough or influential enough, you basically don't really need to follow the rules, as we've seen from people such as Caesar and Pompey.
Obviously, Caesar vehemently disagreed with the conservative faction's interpretation of the law. He argued that even if it was poorly written, the intent was obvious, and subsequent legislation implicitly upheld its original meaning. Specifically, he pointed to the law that the tribunes of the plebs had passed in the year 52, which allowed him to retain his command in Gaul while he stood for election in the year 49. The fact that this law existed meant that everybody was in agreement that his command expired in the year 49.
Yeah, obviously Caesar is correct. That was the intent of the law. But, if we're, getting really finicky and looking at the letter of the law, you could argue it either way if you wanted to. But obviously, in a practical level, he's right. That's why the law was written, to give him that second term for that period. But, if you want to use that legalistic spirit and argue the other way, you definitely can.
The conservative faction pressed on. They decided to proceed as if they had already won the debate, and introduced new legislation to name Caesar's replacement for March of the year 50. Caesar couldn't let this happen, so he flooded the city with bribes, and the bill narrowly went down in defeat. Late in the year, Pompey finally decided to weigh in on the debate. He sided with the conservative faction, which surprised nobody, and asked Caesar to voluntarily step down before the March deadline. Caesar refused, obviously, and continued to argue that he was on the right side of the law. And to an extent, he was right, even if you take the conservative faction at their word and accept that there was some ambiguity in the law. They had failed to clarify the issue with additional legislation. The question of Caesar's command dominated the elections of that year. 2 candidates from the conservative faction were elected consul, and each agreed that Caesar should resign his command by March.
Also, when Caesar isn't back in Rome politicking, the conservatives have a much easier time. They have a much better time winning elections, garnering support, because for the reformers, especially at this point, Caesar is the main man. So he's definitely at a disadvantage in that he cannot come back to Rome. Of course, that's, part of this whole thing, is that he literally can't enter the city as a private citizen or he'll probably be arrested. But that does put him at a disadvantage. He has to operate from afar.
Of the following year.
It's also, and I probably don't need to point this out, but it's pretty obvious that it's not a good situation to be in where your government is arguing with their most powerful general out in the field. Pompey was perhaps the most influential general, but the most prominent active general is arguing with the government over whether he holds his position or not so that he can run in an upcoming election, which they're trying to prevent him from running it. This is all pretty unstable and, definitely not a good place to be in.
At the beginning of the year 50, one of the new consuls introduced legislation that would force Caesar to step down. The other consul shocked everybody by coming out against the proposal, even though he had been elected on this very issue.
Wow.
We later learned that Caesar purchased this betrayal with a massive bribe.
Sneaky.
With the two consuls split on what to do, there was chaos and confusion in the Senate. Finally, one of the tribunes of the plebs spoke up, saying that if the Senate was going to ask Caesar to step down, they should also ask Pompey to do the same. Pompey was in this strange position where he had been given the command of the Spanish provinces, but had left the governing to his deputies, while he remained politically active in Italy. It was highly unusual.
See, and this is what I'm saying. The principle doesn't actually matter. Pompey could do exactly the same thing as Caesar, but if it's Caesar doing it, then, we've got to make a big deal. This is probably even worse than what Caesar's doing. He's literally got an active governorship being run by his subordinates, and he's still allowed to be back in Rome politicking. That is very unusual.
Caesar's allies in the Senate began to argue that this made them uncomfortable, and if Caesar needed to step down, so did Pompey. This is classic whataboutism. Criticize
Yeah.
Caesar, what about Pompey?
Yep.
The two situations really had nothing to do with each other, but Caesar's allies drew a false equivalence between the two and accused the other side of hypocrisy.
Well, sure, the two situations aren't exactly the same, but I don't know if it's a false equivalence. To be fair, I think Caesar actually has a legitimate point, I think he's making a fair point about, he's actually trying to run in absentia while following the rules. He's trying to get it passed. Whereas, Pompey's just doing what he wants. So, to be fair, I think I do agree with the critique that the conservative faction in Pompey were being pretty hypocritical on this one.
This kept the Senate busy for several months. The conservative faction introduced several bills to formally strip Caesar of power, but each one was vetoed by one of Caesar's tribunes of the plebs. The March deadline came and went. With one deadline ignored, the Senate decided to make up a second one. The conservative faction told Caesar that he had until November to step down. This date seems completely arbitrary, and nobody quite knows why they picked it. My best guess is that they were waiting for Caesar's tribunes of the plebs to leave office in December. As the months dragged on, the Caesar question continued to dominate Roman politics. Each side vetoed the other's proposals, resolving nothing. Tempers flared. That summer, the Senate sat to discuss the growing threat of Parthia in the east. For once, the two factions could agree on something, and they decided to send 2 additional legions to Syria. But even this relatively simple procedure became hijacked by politics. For the sake of fairness, the Senate decided that Pompey and Caesar should each contribute a legion to this endeavor. Both men agreed. Caesar started to make preparations, but Pompey pulled a fast one and announced that his contribution would be one of the legions that he had loaned Caesar 4 years earlier. Caesar had just been bamboozled into giving away 20% of his army.
Yeah. Typical Pompey. Very tricky. Well, there you go.
He was not pleased. He visited both legions and announced that for their loyalty, he was doubling their pay and giving each soldier a Gallic slave. This had its intended effect. Instead of marching east, the two legions marched south and set up camp just north of the Alps. The message was unmistakable.
Now it's starting to look pretty dicey. And this might be a good chance to talk about, we've seen Caesar's conquests in Gaul and across the Channel in Britain. And we've seen throughout that he's really secured the loyalty of his legions, through a lot of different means. Through, victory. That's a big factor. If you're winning battles, the people are going to like you. Through, leading them intelligently. Through, some nice rewards. Caesar's always good at handing those out. There's a lot of parallels, and I mentioned this before, to Napoleon, of course. Even though these troops are under the auspices of Rome, of the Senate, in many ways they're far more loyal to Caesar, just like with Napoleon. And so, just keep that in mind as we start to see things getting, like I said, pretty dicey.
The Senate could say whatever it wanted. Caesar's legions weren't going anywhere.
Yeah. And at the moment, what he's doing is blocking an order from the government to march east, for business that they command. So that's bad, but it's not like he's marching against the government yet.
As the year progressed, frustration mounted, and public opinion began to shift. Some people began to call on Pompey to take up arms and end this stalemate.
Whoa.
It might not be a coincidence that around this time, Pompey got very sick and recused himself from public life for a while. I read one historian that said that Pompey definitely got malaria, and another that said that he was definitely faking. There's really not much evidence to support either claim.
Could go either way. I mean, we'll never really know. Obviously, it's very convenient, so you could argue, well, of course he was just trying to escape from the situation. This is way too convenient, but sometimes things just happen at inconvenient times or convenient times. He could have legitimately just gotten sick.
I kind of think that he was faking it to dodge questions, but that belief is based on nothing, so make up your own mind.
Could go either way.
By the time Pompey returned to public life, he was filled with a new resolve. When somebody asked him what would happen if Caesar refused to step down, he answered, "What would I do if my son came at me with a stick?" If Pompey ever had any reservations about a direct confrontation with Caesar, they were long gone.
Damn.
In fact, from this point forward, it's safe to say that Pompey was the leader of the conservative faction. In a sense, the Caesar question had become the central ideological issue in Roman politics. Consequently, it's no longer very useful to think in the terms of a reform faction and a conservative faction.
Interesting.
Instead, let's call them the Caesarian faction and the Pompeian faction.
Wow. I mean, it was kind of already like that before, and we've seen it becoming that, but, it's just really fascinating seeing us move closer and closer to, civil war, basically, but to where we're eventually going to end up with these two factions warring against each other. We can literally see these changes happening in real time. We can see sort of the breakdown of the system. Some would say there are some parallels in our modern day democracy, but you can, work that out for yourself. But yeah, this is, it's really fascinating to look at in retrospect.
By and large, Pompeians dominated the Senate, but it's worth mentioning that there was an entire generation of young, radical senators who strongly identified with Caesar.
Yeah, not to mention, I'm not sure what the public opinion was at this point. Of course, we don't have reliable opinion polling, but what we've seen so far is that the reform, or I guess now the Caesar faction, has generally been a lot more popular with the people, with the public. So that's also worth keeping in mind. The Senate has always been very conservative. It's largely been controlled by the conservative faction, but the people have generally sided with Caesar and the reform faction. Now, like I said, I don't know if that's the case right now, because we don't have public opinion polling, but that has been the case.
Cicero sought to play the moderate and reconcile the two sides. He argued that Caesar had undeniably won great victories for the Republic and deserved another term as consul. He also argued that it was incumbent on everybody, including Caesar, to acknowledge the supremacy of the law. Cicero proposed a middle path, where Caesar subject himself to a slap on the wrist, and then be allowed to run for consul unimpeded.
Cicero doing what Cicero does, where he still tries to respect the law and the Roman way of doing things, but ultimately he's trying to be practical. He's trying to work out a practical solution that isn't going to land everybody with swords at each other's throats. I respect that, but we're kind of already past that point, unfortunately.
Neither side was interested in what Cicero had to say.
Of course.
Month after month, the Senate continued to meet. Month after month, the Pompeians demanded Caesar's resignation. Month after month, the Caesarians would answer, "What about Pompey's command?" Whenever one side got close to passing a piece of legislation, the other side would veto it. Time was running out. Next year, Caesar had every intention of running for consul, and nobody knew what would happen when he did. Crucial elections were held for the upcoming year, and Pompeian candidates won big, securing both of the consulships. Mark Antony, who had served under Caesar with distinction at the Battle of Alesia, was elected tribune of the plebs, making him the highest-ranking Caesarian in Rome.
Yeah, important fella. We saw him at Alesia, sort of his emergence as an important figure in Caesar's life, and of course he will only become more important over time. And of course, we're seeing here conservatives or Pompeians winning elections, but, and I just made the statement that the public generally sided with the reformers, but of course you have to remember that these are not like 100% democratic elections. They're structured in a way that weights certain votes. So, of course, the elections are not necessarily a good judge of overall public opinion.
The Senate's November deadline came and went, and for the second time, Caesar refused to step down. In December, the Senate met yet again to discuss the Caesar question. Pompey spoke first. He announced that he was prepared to make a concession. Once Caesar resigned his command, Pompey would agree to do the same. Mutual disarmament. All Caesar had to do was step down first.
That's kind of tricky, right? I mean, it seems like a fair compromise. They both step down, but the requirement that Caesar does it first, that, leaves open a lot of room for duplicity, which, I think you could very much expect from Pompey.
One of Caesar's men rose to speak. He said that the only way Caesar would even consider something like this was if Pompey was the one to step down first. The Caesarians had been demanding Pompey's resignation all year, and this precondition had never been part of the negotiations. These guys were moving the goalposts. Did the Caesarians even want an agreement, or were they trying to derail the whole thing?
I mean, it's just pure partisanship. And like I said, we see a lot of parallels to that today. It's just if one side does something, then, the other side can't. They have to disagree. They're always at each other's throats. There's no compromise. There's none of that. And of course, this partisanship is partisanship that will become violent, ignite a civil war. And we've been seeing this partisanship get worse over time throughout the Republic's history. And, not to hammer too much on, sort of our modern day situation, because there are absolutely differences. It's not the same. It's definitely not the exact same thing happening, but there are parallels, and if partisanship keeps getting worse and more extreme, then, I'd say it never leads to a good situation, and oftentimes it does lead to violence, which is why we're sort of careful with this kind of thing. And we're going to see a good example of what happens with escalating partisanship, extremist partisanship here.
We don't know. Pompey saw right through this tactic and angrily told the Caesarians that he would not leave Rome undefended, with Caesar still in the field. Pompey would step down, but only if Caesar did so first. This was the Senate, so they put the whole thing to a vote. Should Caesar resign his command? A majority said yes, but the measure was vetoed by a Caesarian tribune of the plebs. Should Pompey resign his command? A majority voted no, and even so, a Pompeian tribune vetoed it for good measure. This wasn't a great look for Caesar. He couldn't be seen to be defying the will of the Senate. A Caesarian tribune stepped forward and said,
I guess, but, at this point, it's literally just a back and forth between Caesar and the Senate. He's been defying the Senate this whole time, basically, and I do see why this would make him look bad, but I feel like if I was in his position or one of his supporters, I would be, suspicious of Pompey and if he would actually follow through with his promise. Of course, that's the issue with this escalating partisanship, is that even if you want to, you're going to have a hard time trusting the other side on any sort of deal that requires faith or goodwill.
Suggested that the two sides compromise by combining the two bills. This question was put before the Senate. Should Pompey and Caesar resign their commands simultaneously? This is one of the rare cases where we actually know the final tally of the vote.
Wow.
370 voted yes. 22 voted no. Despite the Senate's antipathy towards Caesar, most believed that a compromise like this was the only peaceful way forward.
Yeah, in fairness, this is basically the ultimate compromise. It doesn't lean towards one side or another, it's literally both resign simultaneously. How exactly you would do that, I am not at all sure, but I guess it is a good sign that despite the infighting, the Senate still agrees that this compromise position is the best way to go.
However, most of the Pompeian leadership, including Pompey, Cato, and the two consuls, opposed the compromise. They no longer believed that the Caesarians were negotiating in good faith. Well,
I don't think anybody's negotiating in good faith at this point.
Pompey resigned on a certain date, they had no way of guaranteeing that Caesar would do the same. The whole thing could be a trick.
And this is exactly what I was saying when I was talking about the Caesarian faction. How exactly can they trust that Pompey's going to do what he says? Well, now the Pompeians are feeling the same thing. And I think it's fair enough. They're saying, well, how can we trust Caesar to do this? We can't rely on their goodwill. We can't rely on good faith. And both sides feel this, so how are they ever going to work together?
Despite the Senate's overwhelming vote, Pompey reiterated his position that he would only step down if Caesar did so first. Now, both men appeared to be acting in defiance of the Senate. This was kind of a brilliant maneuver by the Caesarians.
Yeah. It is a good one because typically Pompey and the conservatives have the Senate behind them. They're acting basically as the voice of the Senate against Caesar. In this case, for once, the voice of the Senate, at least officially, differs from what Pompey and the conservative leadership want.
Before the vote could be finalized, one of the consuls rose in disgust and screamed at his fellow senators.
Whoa.
The enemy is on the march, and your response is to lay down arms? Enjoy being Caesar's slaves.
Damn.
With that, he nullified the vote by dismissing the Senate and stormed out.
Had a bit of a hissy fit. I feel like that must have seemed a little extreme at the time, though. I guess he was right to a certain extent. He was probably more right than people would have thought at the time. But, I doubt that's because he could see what was coming, more because he was just angry about the way things were going.
After being so close to an agreement, the two sides were back where they started. A few days later, it was rumored that Caesar had responded to this news by marching south with 4 legions. It wasn't true, but nobody knew that at the time. The city broke into a panic. One of the consuls took matters into his own hands and showed up at Pompey's home with a crowd of supporters. The consul presented Pompey with a sword and said, "We charge you to march against Caesar and save the Republic." Pompey accepted the sword and answered, "I will, if no alternative can be found." Cicero privately confessed his fears in a letter. "The current political situation terrifies me. Almost everybody I know wants to avoid a fight and give in to Caesar's demands. Sure, his demands are shameless, but no more shameless than when he asked for a 5-year extension to his term as governor. Why fight him on this?" He closes the letter by bashing Pompey for failing to see that this conflict posed an existential threat to the Republic.
I honestly agree with what Cicero's getting at. Now, of course, if you keep making concessions over and over to Caesar, then, you've got nowhere to go. He's got complete control over you. But in this particular situation, I do think he's right. I mean, they're not really fighting over that much. They're fighting over Caesar being able to run for consul in absentia, basically guaranteeing him a consulship, I would say. He's had one before. Of course, he's going to do his own policy and stuff like that. But, by not allowing him these shameless demands, which they absolutely are, I agree, they are risking something much, much worse. I mean, they're risking a civil war, the destruction of the Republic. I think I agree that just allowing some concessions to Caesar would be the better way to go. But of course, at this point, you may even be past that. Some immediate compromise with concessions to Caesar probably would have been the right way to go, but there's been so much tension between the two sides and so much fighting that they really can't afford to make any compromise, and neither side will give any concessions. But it is just a really kind of tricky, and in some way tragic situation because, listen to what Cicero's saying. Almost everybody he knows wants to avoid a fight. Nobody wants a war. Nobody wants this fight, but they still cannot manage to avoid it.
Shortly after the incident with the sword, Pompey began raising troops in Italy. The Caesarians were apoplectic and attacked Pompey for illegally assembling a legion without the Senate's permission. The Pompeians in the Senate were happy to just look the other way. For the rest of the year, the Senate continued to call for Caesar's resignation, but every time legislation was introduced, Mark Antony and other tribunes of the plebs vetoed it.
49 BC.
On January 1st, 2 new Pompeian consuls took office. In the Senate, Antony read aloud a letter from Caesar. Caesar bragged about his achievements in Gaul and his contributions to the Republic. He concluded by saying that if the Senate passed legislation ordering him to step down, he would refuse to comply unless Pompey resigned his command first. Cicero would later call this letter offensive. Caesar's threat didn't go over well in the Senate. Legislation was introduced.
I'm sure it didn't now. This is not only Caesar's supporters, but this is a direct message from Caesar, basically, like Historia Civilis put it, it's a threat. He's threatening them. He's saying, I'm not going to comply with this government order unless this condition is fulfilled. A whole nother level of shameless and a whole nother level of dangerous.
Saying that if Caesar did not resign his command by a third and final deadline, he would be considered an enemy of the Republic. The bill gave Caesar approximately 7 days to step down. The Senate voted on the bill, and it was nearly unanimous. Then, Mark Antony vetoed the whole thing. The Senate erupted into chaos.
Nearly unanimous. That means almost everybody there. I know it's a conservative-dominated Senate, but there were reformist members. Almost everybody there was, peeved by Caesar's letter. Almost nobody liked it, apart from a few diehard Caesar supporters like Mark Antony.
Behind the scenes, key senators decided to ignore the veto and proceed as planned. If Caesar missed the deadline, they would consider it a declaration of war.
Whoa.
Some days later, an elite group of senators met in Pompey's home to see if they could reach some kind of informal agreement. Pompey, Cato, Cicero, and the 2 consuls for that year represented the Pompeians. Mark Antony and several tribunes of the plebs represented the Caesarians. Cicero cast himself in the role of mediator and attempted to find common ground between the 2 sides.
Yeah, of course he did. Typical Cicero. I think in this we can also see the danger in these institutions becoming politicized. And by what I mean by that is that we've basically got the tribunes of the plebs versus the Senate. Tribunes of the plebs are fighting for the Caesarian faction almost exclusively, and the Senate almost exclusively is fighting for the Pompeian faction. These institutions are not necessarily meant to be partisan. They're meant to, represent the politics whichever way they go, but there should be, the Senate should not be dominated by one faction. And we're seeing that now, same with the tribunes of the plebs, and we're sort of seeing, the danger in this situation.
Mark Antony and the Caesarians came with an offer. Caesar was prepared to step down from 2 of his 3 provinces and would agree to relinquish 8 of his 10 legions. His only condition was that the Pompeians allow him to serve as consul next year. Cicero would have been happy with this compromise, but the rest of
Yeah, I mean, you gotta, at least I empathize with Cicero here. I really get what he's going for. Cicero is just trying to be practical. He is trying to make this situation as good as it possibly can be, because it is a dangerous, very bad scenario that risks the survival of the Republic. So he's trying to get out of this with as little damage as possible. And I'm sure what he's thinking, and I think I agree with him on this, is look, we give Caesar his consulship, that's what he wanted in the first place, and he gives up the vast majority of his legions, meaning he's far less of a threat to us. We give Caesar his prize, it's not that big a deal, and hopefully we get out of this without any warfare. But I suppose we're about to see the Pompeian response to this, but of course we know they're not going to agree to that.
the Pompeians rejected the offer. Cicero cornered Mark Antony for a minute and then came back with a new offer. What if Caesar only kept 1 legion? This was probably the best deal that the Pompeians could hope for. Caesar in control of a province and a legion was hardly a threat to the Republic.
Right. Caesar, he's not going to give everything up. He needs 1, that immunity, and 2, a way to protect himself if shit goes down. But he's agreeing to go down to 1 province and 1 legion. That's not going to be a serious threat to the Republic. This is the best offer they're going to get.
Cicero, Pompey, and one of the consuls accepted the offer. But then, as the 2 sides were coming together, Cato and the other consul spoke up, saying that one of their preconditions to any agreement was that Caesar relinquish all of his legions.
Yes, Cato was, always the ultra-conservative, so unsurprisingly, he would not want to compromise at all.
Antony responded, saying that Caesar would never accept a deal like that. Negotiations broke down, and everybody went home frustrated.
Damn. Seems like they actually got pretty close to a workable deal. I mean, I'm not sure how things would have turned out if that deal had been agreed on. Maybe the violence and warfare would have still happened, maybe. Or maybe it could have been avoided. It's really difficult to speculate on a counterfactual like that. But it is interesting and a little frustrating that they were so close to that deal, but they just couldn't make it work. Largely because of Cato.
I cannot overstate how close they were to an agreement.
Damn.
They basically had it in their hands, and then Cato, that idiot, blew it up.
I see Historia Civilis is thinking the same thing I am. Oh Oh, Cato.
On January 7th, which we assume was the date of the Senate's third and final deadline, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, also known as the Final Act. Uniquely, the Final Act could not be vetoed. All it needed was a simple majority in the Senate. This was basically the Roman equivalent of martial law. It temporarily suspended existing laws and empowered the consuls to do whatever was necessary to defend the Republic. Both of the consuls were Pompeians, and now they could do whatever they wanted. Both agreed to hand their authority over to Pompey.
Damn.
3 days later, on January 10th, Caesar learned that the Senate had passed the Final Act. He was wintering with the 13th Legion near the Italian border.
So close to a behind-the-scenes deal. Didn't work out. And now it's over. It's all over now.
He spent the afternoon working, and that evening attended a dinner party. Nothing unusual. Then, under the cover of darkness, Caesar ordered the legion to break camp and march south at first light.
Ooh.
While the legion was making preparations, Caesar and a few of his officers loaded into a wagon and headed for the Italian border. They stopped at the Rubicon River, which was an insignificant body of water that the Romans used to mark the border between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy. The law forbade any general from entering Italy unless they were specifically invited to do so by the Senate. Caesar had received no such invitation.
Clearly.
He stopped at the north bank of the river and remained there for the rest of the night. In the morning, the 13th Legion caught up with him. Once the legion was in position, Caesar paused for several long moments. Finally, in Greek, he quoted a famous play, "Let the die be cast." With that, Caesar ordered the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. At that moment, Rome entered a state of civil war.
Yep. What a moment it was. Of course, now Caesar crossing the Rubicon is a very famous historical moment. Really a significant moment, clearly, because of what was to follow. That moment with the quote, I will say I'm always very doubtful when we get those sort of cinematic moments with, and then Caesar or whomever, Scipio, quoted this or said that. Yeah, we can't quite be sure what actually happened in the moment, and a lot of this was probably made up after the fact to, add some entertainment factor to make it, like I said, a little more cinematic. But he could have said that. Regardless of what he actually said, it was a very influential moment in Roman and world history. It's just interesting seeing sort of the breakdown of institutions, the partisanship, the polarization, how it keeps getting worse and worse, and now it's eventually going to devolve into violence. Like I said, I think you could draw parallels between this and a lot of other instances of this sort of thing happening. I think there are definitely some parallels to be drawn to the polarization of today, though. I'm sure some of you disagree, and perhaps I'm just being hysterical. Maybe they're not actually that similar, but I think there's something to be said for that. This is an interesting one. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon, which is down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I hope you tune in for the next reaction. Stay tuned for the reaction on Caesar entering Rome. That'll be a big one. I'll see you guys again next time. Goodbye.